Bring up our PowerPoint for today. All right. So if you recall, last Thursday, we started talking about learning, and the two types that we're going to cover today are what's called classical conditioning and opera conditioning. We kind of went over a history of each of these from at least the science side of things about going back to Tolman and up towards Bandura. Yeah, I can't think all of a sudden. And we ended with a funny video from the show. And but today what we're going to talk about is classical and opera conditioning. And the thing that I want everyone to keep in mind as we're talking about these is classical conditioning is going to be what we call associative learning. Okay. And some of the examples I used last time is if you walk into the kitchen, you probably start to feel hunger pains. You walk into your bedroom, you might start feeling a little bit tired. It didn't take you to do anything to learn those associations, okay? Opera conditioning is called opera because it requires the organism to operate in some way, to actually do something. And then through reward or punishment, as we'll get to here in a few minutes, determines whether that will increase that behavior or decrease that behavior in the future, okay? But let's go through each of these. So as I mentioned last Thursday, the person who's kind of synonymous with classical conditioning is Ivan Pavlov. And just as kind of a review, he's a Russian scientist. It's interesting again that we know him for classical conditioning, but his original, what he was interested in was digestion systems. And we should be recognizing him for things for like discovery of acid in our stomach and antacids and stuff like that. But we celebrate him, and he got his Nobel Prize for classical conditioning. But kind of to rehearse what was happening is Pavlov was trying to determine if the intensity of the smell of food increased salivation or decreased salivation in dogs, okay? And so what he did is he surgically installed these tubes into one of the doggies' salivary glands, and then presented them with different intensities of food and measured how much the dog salivated to the intensity of whatever food powder they were given. And as the story goes, I don't know how much this is fact or not, but as the story goes, Pavlov was sitting there one day and he noticed that one of the dogs started to salivate without the presentation of any food. There was no food around, okay? And he wondered why, without a stimulus around, why that dog would be salivating, okay? And as the story goes, what he started to recognize is anytime the dog's handler, the person that fed him, walked into the room, that's when the dog would start to salivate. And he recognized it was the footsteps of the provider that started the dog salivating. And again, hearing sounds of shoes does not naturally elicit salivation, okay? And so he came up with this experiment where he used what's called an unconditioned stimulus, which it's unconditioned because it naturally solicits a behavior in the organism. So for example, food naturally, with no learning, will start the salivation process, okay? And then he had what's called a neutral stimuli. So a bell, of course, might make a startle response, but it has nothing to do with salivation. And so just hearing a bell won't make you salivate or a dog salivate. Okay, and then as he went through his experiment, what he found is that if he paired the bell and the food enough, the neutral stimuli became what's called a conditioned stimulus, meaning that pairing the bell alone or just having the bell go off created salivation even without the unconditioned stimulus there. Okay. And so this is, again, the organism really didn't do anything to associate the bell with food. It's something that just naturally happened because of the pairing of the two. Okay. And so this became known as classical conditioning, and probably the person who really took off with this was John B. Watson, who is quote unquote the father of behaviorism, like we talked about on Thursday. And he saw classical conditioning as kind of that ultimate paradigm to prove that all behavior, everything we do, is a product of associative learning, stimulus response learning. So he's infamous for doing what's known as the little Albert experiment. He took an infant, he wanted an infant because he didn't want someone who has experience. So he wanted an infant because the infant didn't have any experience. And what he wanted to prove is that fear or phobias are produced by learning. They're not something we're born with. Okay. And so he took little Albert and he would first present little Albert with a little white rat. And of course, what did little Albert do in the beginning? What most babies do, he tried to put it in his mouth and to figure it out and played with it. No real response. Okay. But then after that, Watson would clean a bell or get something solid and then present the little white rat. And he'd do that over pairing. And eventually, little Albert came and had a fear response to just the rat without the loud noise. Okay. Now, not only did he become scared of little white rats, he did what's called generalization. Okay. Generalization is when you have a response to anything that is similar to that stimuli. Okay. So if we watch this little video right here, and this isn't enhanced for sound, I just want you to kind of listen to it or watch it. We'll kind of go through it. So we have little Albert, and this is Watson, and he's showing, you know, he's not scared, little Albert. And it's a dog. Monkey. Fire. Yes, babies aren't scared of fire. But now we have the little white rat. And again, he's not scared of it in the beginning. But then he paired it with a loud banging noise. And then eventually little Albert, without the banging noise, would have a fear response to the white rat. And everything fluffy, as you can see, even with this bunny rabbit. So, just so you know, this is one of the first also issues of ethics in psychology. That experiment we wouldn't get away with today. There's major issues with it. The other thing with little Albert is they never counter conditioned that fear response out of him. In fact, we don't even know what happened to little Albert. We suspect he died at a very young age, but no one actually knows what happened to little Albert. But so that's the ethical part of this. But what was Watson trying to show is that he was trying to show that fears and phobias are learned. They're not something that we're born with or innate. and whatnot. And indeed, one of the first treatments for phobia is something we call exposure therapy, okay? Because repeated exposure of a stimuli without the feared pairing, eventually the person becomes not as scared about it, okay? Now, complete exposure doesn't work. What they do today is what's called titrated or continuous exposure. So, for example, if you have like a snake phobia, okay, the first thing that they'll do is they'll put some physiological measures of heart rate and all of those things on you with perspiration, and they'll have you look at a snake on a computer screen until you no longer have that physiological response, okay? And then maybe they will say, put you by a door where on the other side of the door is a real snake. And they'll measure it until you can no longer have that physiological response. And then they put you in the same room with a snake in a cage. And then eventually the snake is outside the cage, you're out, and you're there too, to where you can actually touch the snake eventually, okay? So, and that has been a very successful therapy for a lot of different phobias, okay? The problem is, especially with humans, our number one phobia is social phobias, fear of people, fear of external places. You've probably heard of people who are unable to leave their house because they have such phobic fears of the social world and the social place. And those types of phobias are really hard to extinguish, okay? In a lot of cases, again, you start with them thinking about going outside. And then you put them in a hallway where the exterior door is. And then you put them inside the doorway with the door open. And then you get them on the porch. And then you get them on the sidewalk and try and get them to at least be off their property. The problem is that with social phobias, you have to do that for workplaces. You got to take them to a grocery store, a gas station, clothing store, and you have to do this exposure in all of those social settings. Otherwise, the person does what's called regress, and their phobia actually becomes worse, okay? So usually with social phobias, we use other techniques such as, we'll get to this when we get to abnormal psychology, but more cognitive behavioral therapies. There's also some medications that we can put people on that help. So my point is it gets a little bit more complicated when we're dealing with the phobias that humans have, other than, you know, snakes or spiders. So so that's just kind of those issues. So let's take a look at some different ideas though behind classical conditioning. So in the acquisition stage is when the conditioned stimuli and the unconditioned stimuli are paired. And if you take this as a response curve, you can see that the behavior becomes more and more independent. That this is every time you present the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned, they respond in some way. So salivation and the dog. Now, this is what we kind of meant by counter conditioning, because we know that if we continually pair the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus, eventually the response will go away, okay? The problem is that we have a rest period where nothing is paired, nothing is presented, and if we present the conditioned stimulus, all of a sudden we get something called spontaneous recovery, okay, where you'll actually get a response without those two being paired again, okay. I kind of think of this as the dating, right? So you get involved with someone, oh, love, 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 and you only see him or her, and gosh, you're just totally in love. You get those feelings every time you see them, and oh, how wonderful. But then, their true nature comes out, and eventually those feelings extinguish. Okay, and here down here, you break up with the fool. But a month or so goes by, and you're at Bash's', and you run into that fellow or to that girl and go, why did I ever dump him? He's looking really good today. Oh, I miss him. Oh my goodness, I should go talk to him or her. And this is an example of spontaneous recovery of a learned behavior, is that without that stimulus there for a period of time, if you run into that individual, it's this original thing that you have spontaneous recovery for. So the good feelings you had with that person, and all of a sudden you're like, why did I dump them? Okay. I use this example because I always see people in the rooms understanding it. So this is an example of spontaneous recovery. Okay. So that's classical conditioning, and these are some of the rules around them. Let's go on now to operant conditioning. Okay. So again, we have an operant. The difference is that we have some type of presentation of a stimulus of some type, and then we have a behavioral response. Okay. If we're reinforced, the word often synonymous with this, if we're rewarded for it, that increases the probability of that behavior in the future. If we're punished for it, that reduces the probability that that behavior will occur in the future. Okay. Now, we have what's called positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, positive punishment and negative punishment. And this is what really always ties up students. I know we're in a psychology class, but when you're looking at positive and negative, it doesn't mean an emotion. Okay. When we're talking about operant conditioning and we're talking about positive and negatives, we're not talking about an emotional experience. Okay. When we say positive reinforcement, it means we're going to add something to the situation. Okay. So, little kid cleans their room, you give them a piece of candy. That's positive reinforcement. Okay. Negative reinforcement is we're going to take something away. Okay. And probably the most classical example of this is a child who is throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. Okay. A child throws a tantrum, and this is actually a good example of both positive and negative reinforcement. Okay. And it's getting really bad, and he wants a candy bar, he's screaming on the floor. So what does mom or dad do? They give him a candy bar. Okay. The child is being positively reinforced for that behavior. The parent is being negatively reinforced for that behavior, because you have the child screaming, which is a nauseous situation, and by giving the candy bar, that goes away. Okay. And this is the hard part about extinguishing things like tantrum behaviors. Because the tempting part is, when we're dealing with this type of conditioning, is that it's happening at the limbic system. Okay. It's not happening in your frontal cortex. Okay, where rational thought is. Okay. These types of behaviors are happening at the limbic level. But our rational brain says it's the child's problem. Okay, it's the child throws a tantrum, the child does this. Okay, but as I just brought up, two people in the situation are being reinforced for that same behavior. Okay, we'll use mom as the example. Mom is being negatively reinforced, which will increase the probability that she will encourage that behavior again in order to be rewarded for that behavior again. the child is being positively reinforced. So the child will then also want to engage in that behavior in the future. And what we find with tantrum thing is we actually have to train both the parent and the child equally to break that cycle of behavior. It's kind of interesting, in some research, they actually just got the child to stop tantruming, okay? And then they recorded mom going around the grocery store. And it's really interesting that when the child threw a tantrum, the mom went down the candy aisle once. When the child wasn't throwing the tantrum, the mom actually went down the candy aisle 8 times. And interestingly, she also pushed the cart towards the candy that the child usually had a tantrum towards. Okay, what's happening in there? She's looking for that negative reinforcement that she was rewarded for in the past. Okay, so this is a good example of both positive and negative reinforcement. Okay. Another example of negative reinforcement is a fire alarm in your house or a smoke alarm. Okay, those are so obnoxious, you want to leave that environment and get away from it, and you're rewarded for doing so. Okay, so that's another example of negative reinforcement. Okay. When we look at positive punishment and negative punishment, we're looking at a similar thing. So positive punishment, probably the classical example is spanking a child. Okay, you're adding something negative to the situation, okay, that reduces that behavior. Negative punishment is when you're going to take something positive away. Okay, so teenager isn't doing their homework, they're playing the Xbox, so you go and you take the Xbox away, okay, in order to get them, so you're taking a positive away, entering them into a negative state so that they won't do that as much in the future, okay? So that's negative punishment, when you're taking something positive away or something valued, I should use the word valued away, okay? But there are some rules to punishment that we need to note, especially when it comes to human beings. First of all, the punishment has to equal the behavior that was committed, okay? So for example, the whole spanking issue, okay? Spanking a child will not stop their behavior. It will just make it so they don't do that behavior in front of the parent, okay? And when we look at spanking, it's usually done out of the context of the behavior that was committed, okay? So if we were to use spanking, it should only be used when the child did some type of physical violence to someone else. Because according to the rules of punishment, that's the only time that type of punishment will work to actually reduce a behavior, okay? But if you're spanking a child for yelling or acting out or something like that, that punishment is not going to be effective at all. It will, what it does is it actually does associative learning where the child becomes fearful of the parent because the parent's holding the belt and they become fear of the parent. So instead of stopping that behavior, they just don't do it in front of the parent, okay? The other aspect of both punishment and reinforcement that I kind of mentioned on Thursday is for human beings, you can't, in order for these rules and laws to work, you can't give the element of choice, okay? Once in human beings, you give the element of choice, whatever is stimulating that individual at that time is going to take precedence over what behavior you're trying to change. And a lot of parents, I know, say, oh, those reward charts are bull crap, give them coins and that's a bunch, it doesn't work, they still don't clean their room, they still, and they're absolutely right, because they've given the child an element of choice, okay? So probably a good example of this is let's say we have Billy who's gonna go out and go to a party with his friends. And you tell Billy his curfew is at 11 p.m. And you give the element of choice. If you're not home by 11 p.m., I'm gonna take away your car keys. Okay, so to kind of put you in this idea, let's hit 10:30 p.m. Okay, little Billy is doing really good at his game on the Xbox. Okay, there's these really cute girls he likes from school there, and they're hanging out, and he's drinking this magic juice out of this red plastic cup that's making him feel good. He knows it takes 15 minutes to get home, but at 11:45, what choice do you think Billy's gonna make? In that moment, all right? In that moment, he's gonna go past curfew. And there's just no doubt about it, right? And that's what makes this example so good. But let's not give Billy the element of choice, right? So it comes 11:45, 10:45, let's use mom again. And she knows Billy hasn't left the party yet. 11:50, 10:50, and so what should mom do? Okay, well, if she shows up in her moo nightgown, curlers and everything else and knocks on the door, someone answers and she goes, Billy, it's 11. Guess how many times Billy's gonna be late for curfew after that? Probably never. This is what we call a trial of one, okay? Because he didn't know what was gonna happen if he wasn't home at 11. And the parent shows up and it's like, oh. That's why I have a curfew, because mom's gonna show up, okay? So that element of choice wasn't there, okay? He didn't know what to expect. And that's why when it comes to especially human beings, the reason why we often fail with reward and punishment is because the person, the child, the adult always had that element of choice, okay? And so, yeah, so when you're doing the house rules and everything, if you're gonna use the rules of reward and punishment and operant conditioning, when the kids say, well, what will happen if we break a rule? As a parent says, do it and find out. And you'll find that actually works for humans, but I know there's ethical issues with that. So it doesn't always work the way we want it to. So, all right, so these are kind of some of the rules and ideas behind operant conditioning. And these are just some slides you can look at if you want to get a better understanding of positive and negative. You know, we look at you turn your homework on time, the teacher praises you for your poor performance, you're more likely to turn that in the future. Let's say you turn negative reinforcement, you turn in your homework and your teacher stops criticizing you for turning in late work. That then will increase the probability that you'll do that again in the future. So again, just kind of showing the difference between those two. All right. So when we're looking at punishment, again, positive punishment, you add something to the situation. So your parent yells at you for not cleaning your room, so you clean your room, you stop. What does that say? You stop complaining and those kinds of things. Now, again, with the punishment area too, one of the things we do know with further research is that positive and negative punishment work on a very emotional level, okay? If you ever really want to punish a child, instead of spanking them, withhold affection for a time period. You're taking out a positive, you're putting them into a negative situation, and you'll find that that emotional part will actually be much more effective than saying something like spanking or physical punishment of some type. Okay, don't call your kids names though. I'm not going to encourage that. But it's interesting that on a punishment level, it's actually when our emotions are affected deeply, not our physical body, not getting our Xbox taken away or our car keys taken away. It is the emotional feelings of being punished emotionally that actually is the most effective type of punishment. Okay, I think most women know this though. Just kidding, I'm just kidding.
Does that only work more for children than adults, ultimate toning infection?
So with kids, they're more sensitive to it. But as we become adults, it still works, but we have what's called self-justification. So, you know, if you're, for example, if your spouse withholds love from you, you as an adult, you can justify it. You can say, oh, she's in a bad mood. Oh, you know, she has had a bad day. It's not because of me or what I did. And so as adults, we can go through a self-justification. It works more effectively with kids because they don't have that, they're just coming to the realization, hey, mom's not hugging me. She's not talking to me. It's because of me. What did I, and they don't have that self-justification process. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, so yeah, it is more effective with children than adults, but it does still work with adults as well, as long as it's done right. In a non-self-justification, justificating way. So. All right. So the other thing we should look at is what produces the strongest type of learning. Okay, so this comes from research B.F. Skinner did with animals. It's also just so you know, in your behavior modification project, when it's talking about what interval are you using or what schedule of reinforcement you're using, this is what it's referring to, okay? So there's two types of schedules. There's what we call ratio and interval, okay? Ratio is that the organism is rewarded based on the number of times a behavior is committed. Variable intervals are based on time, okay? So it's not the number of behaviors you commit, it's about the time, okay? And probably the easiest way to look at this is if you get paid bi-weekly, okay? Your pay is not based upon your work quality, it's based upon time, okay? And what we find is this ends up giving us a scalloped reinforcement schedule, okay? That, so this is payday, and our performance actually goes down. Let's say we're doing bi-weekly. The week after payday, we find that employees' performance goes down. But then in that week just before payday, we find that individuals actually start to be more productive, okay? And so it's a scallop type of thing, okay? When we're doing variable intervals, this is when the time when the organism is going to get rewarded isn't fixed, it's variable. So maybe here is 5 minutes, maybe here is 2 days, maybe here is another 5 minutes, and it's variable. And if you notice, this keeps a steady level of performance, okay? Now, so those are both based on time. You can see that these are much slower slopes than when we get into ratios. Okay, so ratios has to do with the number of behaviors. A fixed ratio is when the organism is rewarded for a fixed number of behaviors. Okay, so for example, every time Billy picks up a piece of clothes, Billy gets a piece of candy, okay, every time. Okay, and this is what's called a fixed ratio, all right? A variable ratio is you don't know when the next reward is gonna come, okay? And so maybe it's after you committed the behavior 10 times, 1 times, 5 times, and the like, okay? The variable ratio is also one of the ways that psychologists explain gambling behavior, okay? Because if you're at the slot machine, you don't know how many times you have to pull that lever in order to get that prize, okay? But you don't want to stop pulling because it might be the next time you pull the lever, you just don't know, okay? And again, research on this shows that if we do gambling on a fixed ratio, it actually reduces the number of times people pull on the lever, okay? If we vary it, the people will stay there at the machine longer and pull it more often, okay? And so this is one of the ways that we explain things like gambling behavior, okay? We can also see this in things like relationships, okay? If, for example, you and your partner get intimate every other Friday, okay? You're gonna end up with this scallop thing, okay? Where the week right up to Friday, you see their affection increase because they know that that intimacy is gonna come. But after that intimacy, they're just gonna roll over and go to sleep, okay? On the fixed ratio, yes, I know when it's coming, I get it every time. But you'll probably notice that if you are in a relationship and you really care about them, and you text, and maybe they respond sometimes they respond right away to your text. Sometimes they don't respond until you texted them 5 times. You don't know the next time you're gonna get intimate. It's kind of very random ratio. You'll notice that your feelings for them become stronger, okay? Than when it's a predictable variable in intimacy, okay? And so, yeah, there's your dating advice for today. Don't give it up every time and don't do a schedule, just be very random about it. Okay, so there you go, there's your relationship advice for today. But this is the schedule that I want you to these are the different schedules I want you to consider when you do your behavior modification, because there is a question in there, what schedule of reinforcement you're gonna use. So are you gonna use a variable one, a fixed one? Are you gonna base it on time, or are you gonna base it on numbers of behaviors? So consider this is an important aspect of that assignment, okay?
Can you use a mix, like, say you start out with a fixed ratio and then ultimately to a variable ratio, can you do that?
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, and just as Tim was mentioning, can you mix these up? Absolutely, and that's actually what creates even a stronger learned behavior, is when you adjust these because it makes sense to, okay? If you think about you know, just as an example, let's say you go to work every day and your boss every day for the first year says, I'm glad you're here, okay? But then sometime later, a year later, your boss is just saying it every Monday, okay? Believe it or not, that change in the way the employee is gonna be reinforced will actually make it so that employee stays with that employer longer. Because you went from one schedule to another. Does that make sense, Tim?
Yeah, it's kind of like when people exercise the plateau effect, where they reach a point and it stops, and so they have to change up their exercises, so same thing.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, just like the plateau effect, Tim was mentioning the plateau effect with workouts. Yeah, you gotta change the schedule of reinforcement that you're doing in order to get over that plateau.
Okay.
Excellent example. Okay. All right, and so the last type of learning that we need to talk about is called social learning. It's also been called observational learning. Okay. Now, what makes observational learning, or I'm gonna use the term social learning, unique about human beings and a few other species kind of like us, is that we're not necessarily born with a pre-programmed set to learn, okay? From ants to wolves in the wild to tigers in the jungle, they're all programmed to learn a certain survival behavior. They're born with that. And so they do what's called imitative behavior. And that's how they learn to hunt like mom. They're programmed to do it. And so they imitate the mother in order to learn how to do it, okay? Now, what's the difference between imitation and what we're talking about when we're talking about observational learning? Probably the best example I can come up with is, let's say, you're learning to cook, okay? So you watch mom, you watch aunt, you watch dad, you watch grandma, and maybe they've all made the same dish, okay? The rules of imitation is that you will fix the behavior to what's imitated, what is done, okay? The difference between that and social learning is the child will take what they saw with their sibling, with their dad, with their grandparent, with their mother, combine those behaviors to make it a unique behavior for them. Okay, so the behavior is much more variable than a fixed imitative behavior, okay? And that's kind of the main difference between imitation versus observational learning, okay? Because we get such a wider variety of behaviors. And again, when we look at this from an evolutionary perspective, this is one of the arguments that make humans adaptive to almost any environment on this earth, is because we don't have a fixed set of learned behaviors that we need to learn to survive in a given environment. We have the ability to observe and learn from the environment and learn from all kinds of people and different ways of existing and surviving within a given environment. Okay, so those are kind of some things to consider when we're talking about this. Now, kind of the ideas behind observational learning is we have to attend to something, we have to retain it and combine it and manipulate it. And then we have to motor produce it to see if it works for ourselves, for who we are. So an example of this is when we get into developmental psychology, we'll talk about when is a person's identity and who they're going to be really determined, what age, okay? And we're gonna find that the biggest predictor of someone going to college, going to blue collared or white collar work, whether they're gonna be a family person or not a family person, is between the age of 4 to 6. Okay, though that age, the child's attitudes, how they play, how they interact, their attitude towards school and everything else, that is the number one predictor of what they'll do as an adult and what they will identify. Okay, because what are kiddos doing during this age? They're doing a unique kind of play. And what type of play is it? No, it's okay. It's when they're taking on all these different roles in their world. Okay, so they watch Superman, so they go put a towel around their neck and they run around the house. They see Spider-Man, they look at firefighters and play firefighters, doctor and play doctor, play house, they do all of these different roles, okay? Now, why is play so important during this age? Because that child is learning, one, what works for them, what's gonna make them unique, what is part of them that gives them their sense of identity. But it's also giving them the opportunity to go into all of these different roles and try them on. Okay? And what are they doing? Okay, in the Superman situation, they watch Superman on TV. Okay, they think about, God, what would it be like to be the Man of Steel? That was really fun. So what do? We motor produce it. We go throw that towel around our neck and we start flying around, like thinking we're flying. And then if we're reinforced for that behavior, or there's some type of, it makes us feel good, we might retain an essence of Superman. Maybe it's his values, his virtues. We know we're not still, and we know it hurts when we try to fly, but there's some qualities about Superman that maybe we continue to take on after playing that role, okay? And so, again, when we get to developmental psychology, we'll talk about this age group and the importance of play. Okay, and then what they do with it when they go through the elementary years, and actually try to see if that has value to other people. But we'll kind of give a cliffhanger at this moment. Okay. So again, last Thursday I mentioned the Bobo doll experiments as an example of social learning. Okay, and if you remember, just to kind of rehearse this. In the Bobo doll experiments, as we'll see in this video, the teacher either just constructs the Bobo doll non-violently or she's very aggressive with it. And what we wanted to know is what would the children's behavior the next day be, okay? So this is kind of a example. So we have the teacher, she's hitting it with a mallet of some type, she's throwing it around. Being aggressive with it, kicking it. Jumping on it, hitting it. So the question is the next day, how will the child react to it? Now, again, this is a good example of social learning. You'll notice that this little boy is hitting it with a mallet, but he's going to do something violent that the teacher didn't do the day before. He'll get a gun or a play gun, the toy gun. Okay. Oh, this isn't that scene yet. Yeah. So you see the little boy has his toy gun now. That's something the teacher didn't do, but the behavior is carried over. Okay. Calling it names, hitting it. And just as I mentioned on Thursday, this video is focusing on the little boy. We found the same thing with little girls as well. They used a slightly different type of violence. Instead of using a toy gun, they usually use more verbal assaults, which isn't surprising given the difference between boys and girls and the type of aggression we see. Okay. Now, this experiment has been used to show that when you have a child view violent TV and stuff like that, that's what creates aggression. And it started this whole debate. Okay. And so this is the part of the experiment that was advertised, that modeling aggression creates aggression. Okay. But the Bobo doll experiment is what we call a 2x2 design. Okay. So let me explain what the actual experiment looked like. Is on the modeling day, they either had an aggressive teacher or a non-aggressive teacher. Okay. On the following day, they also again had an aggressive or non-aggressive teacher. She wasn't aggressive or non-aggressive with the Bobo doll, but she was aggressive or not. Okay. And this is what complicates modeling violent behavior, creates aggression, okay? Is if the child viewed an aggressive teacher the day before, an aggressive teacher the next day, the child was non-aggressive towards the bubble doll. Okay, it was only in the condition where he saw the teacher aggressive the day before, and then the next day the teacher was non-aggressive, that increased the child's aggression. Okay. Similar with the non-aggressive situation. So if a child the day before saw a teacher who was non-aggressive, but the next day she was acting very aggressive, that actually increased the aggressive behavior of the child towards the Bobo doll. Because of that aggression that they were feeling at the moment, they had to take it out on something. Okay. And just as you would guess, non-aggressive teacher the day before, non-aggressive teacher the next day, decreased the probability of aggression. Okay. So the point being is that the association between viewing aggression and the production of aggression the next day is more complicated than what has been advertised in the popular media. Okay. And this also, again, when we do things like why don't children speak up when they're being abused, or why don't all children who are abused become abusers? Believe it or not, that's a myth. Only a small percentage of children who were physically abused as children actually become physical abusers as adults. Okay. Why? Well, if you have a child that is constantly with an aggressive parent, that actually is going to reduce their propensity towards aggression, acting out and trying to get out. They're going to try and act good. Okay. However, if you have a very inconsistent parent who's aggressive one day and non-aggressive the next, that's actually going to increase the child's aggression. Okay. And then, of course, in the other condition where you have an inconsistent teacher, an inconsistent model, so one day she's aggressive and the next day she's not, again, that increases the chances of aggression in the child. Okay. It's only in these consistent categories where you have a decrease of aggression. Okay. And so I should note this: what is the debate today about viewing violence and violent video games and stuff? What is the association between the two? Is that it is true that when you do a violent game or you watch something, if we measure your cortisol levels, they will stay high for about 24 hours. Okay, that doesn't necessarily relate to behavior though. Okay, what we have actually found that the association between video games and aggression is it actually has little to do with the amount of violence the child is viewing during the video game, but the competition. Okay, so for example, we have kids in the lab, we have some teens and some kids who play single player, what's a violent single player game? Anyone? I can't remember the names. The first shooter games, those kinds of things.
Like Grand Theft Auto.
Yeah, like Grand Theft Auto, all right. And then we have people play the football game Madden. Okay, and we wanted to know which the non-violent but competition game, or the violent but no competition game, which one increased aggression. And what we found is for the next week, up to 7 days, playing Madden actually increases aggression, not playing that violent video game, because of the element of competition. Okay, so we're finding more and more the association between video games and TV and everything else. It really has little to do with the amount of violence, but it has to do with how competitive that game is, that actually is associated with levels of aggression in children and adolescents. So kind of an interesting, that's kind of the state of the literature right now. I'm gonna put it that way. 5 years from now, it might be something completely different. But the state of the literature right now is, it seems that competition, not necessarily violence, increases aggression. So. So I'm gonna end class with just talking about B.F. Skinner and Noam Chomsky. Many of you may know Noam. He actually is a emeritus professor at the University of Arizona in the language department. And that's his main area. He's also a very outspoken critic of government and whatnot. He's written a lot of books about those kinds of things and is very outspoken about it. But when he was in graduate school, when he was getting his master's degree, B.F. Skinner wrote a manuscript on how language could be explained by using the rules and laws of classical and opera conditioning, that we learn language, okay? Now, when you get a manuscript like this, usually you write maybe a page critique, max, most of the time. While Noam went ahead and wrote almost his own same amount of manuscript. I think his response to B.F. Skinner was greater than like 25 pages, which is unheard of, okay? And this is really going to be the downfall of behaviorism, that everything can be explained by a learned history of reinforcement and punishment and associative learning, okay? That maybe there is something in our mental life that gives a way to behavior instead. Because the main criticism of Noam Chomsky is that language, according to Skinner, is shaped and reinforced, okay? And we can see this in communication even with non-human organisms. It's a habit, repetition, stimulus, response, association. That's how we learn language. Where Chomsky is what we call a nativist, okay? In that he believes that we're born with the wiring to learn language without reinforcement, without it being something that is taught, okay? That we're born with this ability, it's not necessarily something that comes out of stimulus response occurrences. My best example of this is between the age of 0 and 6, the average child will know between 50 to 60,000 words, okay? In the guise of behaviorism, I don't know about you guys, I don't remember my mom rewarding me 60,000 times by the age of 6. Where every time I came up with a new word, I didn't get an attaboy, I didn't get a good job, I didn't get a piece of candy, I didn't get anything. It just happened, okay? And that's the issue with saying that language is something that is learned, that it's done through reward and punishment, is that language in and of itself is too complex to just be this reinforced history of words, okay? And that's basically what Chomsky's arguing, is he's saying, listen, we develop language so fast and so quickly, it can't be something that is learned through reinforcement and punishment, okay? And indeed, we talk a lot about this in the cultural psychology class, as Luke knows, is that when we look at different cultures, okay? For example, here in the United States, we emphasize reading, right? We emphasize talking to your child. There's these programs where you're actually putting speakers on mom's belly while the child isn't even born yet, right? And we have a real emphasis on language development, okay? And then there's cultures who don't even talk to their child for the first 2 years. It's completely silent to them, okay, for the most part, okay? Yet children in our culture and children in those cultures will start to produce language roughly at the same age, okay? And so this kind of goes back to Chomsky, Noam's idea of it being a nativist idea, is that regardless of culture and the emphasis on language, children will start to develop language roughly at the same time, okay? Now culturally, the complexity of their language will differ, but they'll basically start speaking their native tongue at about the same time, okay? So again, this just emphasizes this idea that we're not just these empty vessels of a reinforced and punished history. Okay? There has to be something more. And language is one of those complex things that we can go to and go, listen, here's proof that we have a mental life of some type. Because this just happens too quick and too complex for it to be something that we're rewarded and punished for. Okay. And thanks to this is where we get into what's called the cognitive revolution, where psychologists will still use the scientific methods of behaviorists, but will start to investigate the mind again and mental life and thought processes and decision making, which is kind of where we're heading into the next part of this section, okay? Is we're gonna start talking about things like memory, cognition, scholarly intelligence, emotional intelligence, and that's kind of where we'll be heading on Thursday and probably next Tuesday, is talking about those mental topics that we now need to look at, because things just can't be explained by stimulus response associations, okay? So that is where we're headed, but I think we've had enough for today. I'm gonna reward you all. We're gonna leave class early. Let me stop sharing real quick and stop recording.